Hello, this is Dr. Frank Miller coming to you from Western North Carolina and the public mental health service system of this state. This is mid-September 2017. I apologize for the long hiatus in this podcast now of approximately 2 months due to health problems on my part. To set the context of current events right now, we have just had the horrific hurricanes, first Harvey hitting Houston, and then Irma hitting the state of Florida. I have a sister who resides where Harvey struck, and I have heard firsthand, after I was able to reconnect in communications with her, after literally a 12-day absence of being unable to hear from her, get in touch with her, or know exactly what her situation was after she and her husband had to evacuate. And this was a tense time. And then hearing from her on several phone call occasions, initially to give her quite a bit of emotional support, because what they went through was typical of hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people in the Houston area, was quite harrowing. And I found myself wondering if I would have been able to cope and adapt as rapidly and as well as she did when services went out universally in the area and the basic essentials, including air conditioning, which is essential in Houston. Houston used to be famous for giving the consul staff of consulates of the oil countries stationed there hazardous duty pay because of the climate. The heat and humidity really are a lethal combination and dominate everything in Houston in the really protracted summer. I'm from the Southwest, so I'm familiar with dry heat of Arizona, Texas, Western Texas, and New Mexico. But Houston is like Miami on steroids in the summertime especially. In any case, we've had lots of other events, including recently a couple more mass shootings, including a school student who apparently may have been bullied and opened fire at his school with a handgun he had stolen from his father's safe last week. And upon initial interview, the information was come out that he wanted to teach everyone a lesson about being bullied, and somehow chose this as his avenue of expression. One person died, and he has been charged with murder. There is another shooting, an attempt at mass shooting by 2 individuals, and one of whom has been labeled already very quickly as possibly chronic schizophrenic. And this was an unusual case of 2 women, which is fairly unusual for these situations. And this is the continuing backdrop that motivates my talk today in reviewing where we have come and what still faces us in mental health reform. Now, to give you a quick overview of approximately 130 years of mental health reform, I'd like to do this in just a very few minutes and mention and outline the major way stations in the care of the mentally ill that we have gone through in this country and in general in the Western world. This began in the 1700s when the Quakers began to take account of the chronically mentally ill and began to establish true mental hospitals, with the first in Pennsylvania and shortly after that in Williamsburg, Virginia, which later evolved into Eastern State Psychiatric Hospital in Williamsburg, which still functions to this day as a major treatment center for the state of Virginia. These early attempts at, if you will, residential care of the mentally ill were a step up from what had been going on since time immemorial everywhere. The mentally ill were excluded, walled off, put in almshouses, put in jails, put in asylums for the mentally ill, although they were not called that for hundreds of years, and kept literally chained to walls and lived in dreadful conditions, were regarded as being possessed by evil spirits, and so on. As the concept of mental illness evolved by the 1400s in Geel, Belgium, where families began to take in a mentally ill person and care for them lifelong, evolved and is probably the best model of caring for the chronically mentally ill in the community, which still goes on today and is still an incredibly well-studied model, but unfortunately has not made it very far past this one city in Geel in Belgium, and it is variously spelled G-H-E-I-L, G-H-E-E-L, and G-E-E-L. It had its roots in the arrival of a Catholic saint in the town, and the history of how this evolved into caring for the mentally ill in the Middle Ages, I would remind you, where we had probably the dimmest view of the mentally ill in Western civilization's history. History is extremely interesting, and I would commend the listener to seeking out the history of Geel, Belgium, and its care of the mentally ill, and say any historical database such as Wikipedia, for instance, has an excellent write-up on this phenomenon. Then we went to organized hospitals that were built specifically for the care of the mentally ill. Again, the Quakers led the way with the two aforementioned efforts, which began to be adopted by the state governments of Pennsylvania and Virginia in the mid-1800s. These finally consolidated into being called institutions for the insane, asylums, or mentally ill hospitals. There was no real organized approach to treatment except the second phase of treatment of the mentally ill. The motivation was to provide these unfortunate souls, as they were viewed, with humane treatment, and to try to humanize their care in these facilities as much as possible. Hospitals were located in the countryside, again, far away from cities. Patients were allowed, if possible, to work, especially in agriculture-related efforts to make these facilities as self-sufficient as possible, as well as to enjoy the outside and have a humane existence, even if it were somewhat hopeless and was considered, even at the outset of their entry or placement into these facilities, as being lifelong, since there was no treatment other than what I've just mentioned. heads of hospitals who evolved to be the American psychiatric community were physicians who were interested in the study and observation of the mentally ill, and they were called superintendents. The later psychiatric movement that popularized American psychiatry really did not get started until World War II and after, with the emigration of all the psychoanalytic community to Britain and the United States, since most of them were Jewish, to avoid the Nazi persecution. I would just add, ironically, it would be interesting if we took the present-day approach to immigration and somehow, in this day and time, prevented that kind of unitary intellectual community with all that it brought from entering this country. We would have missed a lot. And I think that kind of analogy and example to keep in mind is a worthwhile effort in the current somewhat xenophobic and misguided discussions and fears about immigration that we see at the present time. But that's a political aside and my own personal view. But nonetheless, this country, we benefited from the debtor crisis of England and Scotland in the 1700s, formation of the American colonies, waves of immigration in the 1800s especially. Toward the end of that century, the Germans, the Irish, East Europeans, Russians, in waves, the Italians, Sicilians, and many other groups that enriched the history, culture, and built this country from the ground up and provided the human capital, if you will, for better or for worse, that enabled the expansion of this country into and past its frontiers, and resulted in the geography and the early infrastructure of the 1800s. In any case, the next phase of mental health reform began to be the attempts at early treatment. Now, they may have lasted from the 1700s with all kinds of bizarre things largely promoted initially by the French, water baths, mesmers, magic water table device which was a metal box with rods sticking into it that had water in it that supposedly made some kind of electric current. And if you held the rod, you got some kind of therapeutic effect. Many of the early treatments were abusive in nature, but sometimes necessary with the truly desperately, physically, violently mentally ill. Straitjackets, canvas wraps, and bizarre water immersion treatments, anything that restrained a patient and would calm them down in the eyes of the caretakers. Finally, in the 1930s, we had the appearance of the early forms of shock therapy, convulsive therapy to the brain, including, of course, electric shocks, use of a medicine, metrazole, a stimulant, which caused the therapeutic seizure, and insulin coma therapy. These were rapidly winnowed out to the safest and most predictable and manageable of the three: electric convulsive treatment, and this became the mainstay for a few decades before and after World War II. In the 1950s, we began to have the appearance of the pharmacologic agents, especially thorazine, an antipsychotic, and Elavil or amitriptyline,